What's up, and I'm super excited about this video today. In this video, I will teach you how to properly set your camera or your smartphone to get perfect videos every single time. I'll start by saying that shooting videos on a camera and a smartphone is not very different. The camera just has a little more modes and flexibility in terms of settings, and on smartphones, you need to be a little more persistent in finding compromises. The first step of shooting a video on a camera is to choose a mode. In automatic mode, the camera automatically adjusts the exposure settings, including shutter speed, ISO, white balance, and aperture. It's obvious. This is a good mode for beginners, but it can sometimes make mistakes, so it is best to avoid it in most cases. You can use it, but be careful. Aperture priority mode allows you to control the depth of field and is good for portraits and talking headshots. In this mode, you select the aperture and the camera figures out the rest by itself. Shutter priority mode allows you to control the motion blur by setting the shutter speed while the camera adjusts everything else. Manual mode gives you complete control over all settings. This is the most powerful mode, but it requires more experience and understanding of how a camera works. Yet only in manual mode you can really make your vision a reality. So smartphones typically have only two modes, automatic and manual. In automatic mode, you can only control the focus point and exposure. In manual mode, you have more control over the settings, but the flexibility is limited by the hardware of the smartphone. Use automatic mode if you don't want to worry about the settings, but don't forget about the limitations. I prefer manual and advise you to do the same here. Now let's talk about these parameters. There are only 6 of them: exposure, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, focus, and white balance. If you master these parameters, you will be able to shoot any video you want. In a nutshell, exposure is the amount of light that hits the camera's sensor, so it's literally the overall value of brighter, darker. The aperture is the size of the hole in the lens through which light passes. This hole can be either narrower or wider depending on the parameter that you set. The shutter speed is the time for which light falls on the sensor. The shutter speed is literally a door that opens for a period of time that you set and closes back. ISO is the light sensitivity of the sensor. White balance is responsible for the correct shades of white depending on the temperature of the ambient light. White should always remain white regardless of whether the lighting in the room is warm or cold. And the focus, that's pretty much self-explanatory at this point. The most difficult thing to get right is light. This includes setting the exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If you choose the parameters wrong, the video will be dark and noisy or overexposed and without details. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are 3 exposure parameters that interact with each other. For example, when in auto mode you move the exposure slider, you're simply telling the camera, make the picture darker and adjust the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO yourself. The camera will do it, but the final result will be very different. Changing one parameter may require changing other parameters to maintain correct exposure. For example, shutter speed and aperture are interchangeable exposure parameters. Widening the aperture makes the picture brighter and therefore forces you to make the shutter speed shorter and vice versa. Also, widening the aperture forces you to reduce the ISO value because picture becomes brighter again. And no matter what video you shoot and no matter how you choose the parameters, you can be sure of one thing: the camera is just a tool, and to make the footage truly beautiful, it needs to be properly edited. And one of the best ways to do this is to use Movavi Video Editor. It has everything you need to create professional looking videos without complexities that can be overwhelming for new users. Movavi Video Editor includes a wide range of effects, animations, and music to help you create engaging videos. It also has a number of smart features that can help you save time and effort, such as automatic background removal and noise reduction. And now the most interesting part. Get ready to have your mind blown, folks. Movavi's got a deal that's too good to pass up, an 80% discount on all the apps in an amazing Movavi Unlimited plan. That's right, you heard me, 80% off. So don't wait, hit the link and get yourself the ultimate video editing and production experience at a price you won't believe. Trust me, this is one offer you don't want to miss. So how do all these parameters really work? First, I recommend deciding on the style you want to get from the camera, regardless of the lighting scenario. For the sake of simplicity, let's take a talking head video for a YouTube channel as base level. The exposure should be somewhere around 0. This means that your image is well exposed in terms of brightness. So our task is to adjust the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture as we need them while keeping the exposure at 0. For a talking head, like this shot right here, I recommend keeping the aperture no smaller than f2.8 if possible. This will get rid of unnecessary noise and will give a nice blurred background like I have now. Most likely you're shooting at 24-25 frames per second or most 30 frames per second. So set the shutter speed at 1/50th. This is the most realistic balance of motion blur and FPS. Keep the ISO as low as possible because increasing the ISO increases noise, and we don't need noise. Try not to go above ISO 640. The noise at that level gets really bad. So here are parameters for a talking head shot. Aperture at f2.8, shutter speed 1/50th at 24-25 frames per second, ISO no higher than 640. Now you might be thinking, what if I crank up the aperture or shutter speed to the max? I'd say it's a rare case and usually a purely stylistic decision. If you want the sleepy person effect, set the shutter speed to 1/10. Don't want to worry about the focal point, set the aperture to f9 and everything will be in focus. But sometimes you physically can't set the needed parameters, and there are a few ways around this. Problem number 1, bright sunny day, shooting outdoors. In such conditions, I highly recommend using ND filters. Why? Because if you switch from indoors to bright sunlight, you will notice that everything is overexposed. You become forced to set the ISO to the minimum, aka 100, but usually this is not enough. You still need to make the shutter speed shorter, 1/400th, or even shorter to make the image darker. But this way you lose the realistic motion blur, and if you close the aperture to f8 or f16, you will sacrifice the beautiful background blur. And if you put on ND filter, you can reduce the exposure with it and set the settings that suit you. Problem number 2, shooting in artificial lighting. Here you need to increase the brightness of artificial light when the exposure in the camera is 0 at your settings. Otherwise, you have to sacrifice something. Either ISO goes above 640, leading to noise, or the shutter speed gets longer than 1/50th, and you get this sleepy man effect. You can buy the f1.4 lens, but cranking up the light is much cheaper. Problem number 3, low light. Either we increase the ISO and get more noise, or buy a faster lens, or we make the light brighter. There are expensive cameras with dual native ISO like the Sony a7S III, where you set ISO to 12,800 and the noise just disappears, but it's rarely really needed. It's easier to max out the lights or shoot under the sunlight. Well, most likely you will be shooting everything in a studio or your apartment, and therefore you will only need to adjust the parameters once. After you find the optimal combination of parameters, they will not change much from time to time. But what about white balance? I didn't miss it, but I left it out of the picture, so to speak, because even though white balance is not the easiest topic, there is one life hack. Always carry a sheet of paper with you, and when setting the white balance, focus on the color of the sheet. The sheet should be white at all times. The last important aspect is focus. Here, the result largely depends on your camera. If you have a modern camera such as the Sony ZV-E10, you can forget about focus. The autofocus in the camera is very good and will perfectly track you or any object in the shot. But if your camera is older, you may need manual adjustment, and there are some important things here. For example, you can manually set the focus on the lens to some specific point or object, but in this case, everything outside the focus point will be blurred. And if you're shooting handheld or actively moving in the shot, you may end up with a blurry video instead of a sharp one. Shooting video on a smartphone is pretty similar to shooting with a camera. The same basic principles, but there is less flexibility in terms of settings you can control. For instance, You can't adjust the aperture on most smartphones, so you will need to focus on exposure, shutter speed, and ISO. Due to the small sensor in smartphones, capturing high-quality video is only possible during the day or in good natural lighting. And don't forget about the impact of processing algorithms, which play a significant role. If you're serious about shooting high-quality videos with your smartphone, consider investing in an iPhone 15 Pro, which offers log recording for more control over the colors and slightly better quality. But before you do that, check out our video comparing the iPhone and a normal camera. The tips I've shared are just the tip of the iceberg. It's just scratching the surface. The knowledge you've gained will get you started, but as you delve deeper, you will discover a whole new world of possibilities, lenses and their features, stabilization, histograms, track and focus, and much more. The camera in your hands is a gateway to creativity, so don't be afraid to experiment and explore, figure out what your camera can and can't do, and check out our other videos for more tips and tricks. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.